I'm Annie, and this is how I built a prototype for my very first video game in just 2 days. Just kidding, took me 2 months. I'll show you how the game evolved over the course of 2 months, the things I learned along the way, and of course what I struggled with. At this point in time, I've actually progressed much further and beyond the prototype you'll see, but I'll talk more about that in an upcoming video. Before we get into how I built my prototype, I should probably tell you what I'm trying to do here. The game I'm building is a 2D arcade style game. As you can see in this beautiful drawing I made when I came up with the idea, the player has a top-down view of a railway network and is responsible for directing different types of trains to their destinations by operating the railway switches within the network. I think the goal will be to score enough trains in each destination in order to unlock new levels, but I haven't fully fleshed this out yet. The railway network will of course be different per level, maybe even procedurally generated, and I plan to introduce new game mechanics and train types and skins as the player progresses. If you want to check out all the other terrible ideas I had before coming up with this one, you can check out my video on that by clicking on the link in the corner. So, to get started, I went ahead and created some very sophisticated train sprites to start out. As I'm sure you can easily tell, this right here is a steam train. In my Unity project, the first thing I needed was a way to represent the railway network. I set up 3 track prefabs, adding a simple line renderer to each so that I can use them to put together a network. Of course, the entire point of the game will be to control parts of the network in order to make trains go where we want them to go, so I created a switch prefab. And finally, we need trains, so I stuck my train sprite onto a train prefab. Now, the next step was to write some code. The tracks at this point were pretty basic, but the switches needed some logic to let the user, well, switch the direction. So I put a simple 2D collider to detect mouse clicks or taps on mobile devices, and added some simple logic to toggle the switch. The train logic is where things got more interesting as I had to make them move along the tracks. I knew I definitely wanted to adjust the tracks later to be smooth and round curves, and I did, by the way, so I wanted to keep this code general enough to work for that case, which complicated things quite a bit, but I got it to work semi-well in the end. Fortunately, I later found a better way to move trains along their tracks, which I'll talk more about in a moment. Anyway, I also wrote a spawner that picks a random train color and spawns a new train on a random start track. And finally, we need to know where to direct our trains, so I created this depot prefab, and I use it to update the score. For now, you just get a point for each train that reaches the right depot, and you lose a point if a train ends up in the wrong depot. But as I mentioned, I definitely plan to change the scoring system in the future. My plan right now is to add a capacity to each depot so that the goal will be to fill them all up with the correct trains to move on to the next level, while you're only allowed a certain number of misses. Definitely let me know in the comment section below how you feel about this scoring system and whether you would do it differently. Also, right now, you can only tell by the colors of the trains and depots whether they're a match, which is not great from an accessibility standpoint. For example, for colorblind people, so I'll have to think of a fix for that later on. So this version of the game is what I have declared my basic functioning prototype. So as you can tell, when I say basic, I actually mean very basic. But I think it has served its purpose since I was able to assess whether I can realistically build the game I have in mind and whether the simplest version of the game mechanic is interesting. I think it is, but I'll need to add nice and satisfying sound effects and animations, and I'll need to be careful about the difficulty arc so the game doesn't get boring or too challenging too quickly. So all of this probably sounds like a quick and straightforward journey to you, but don't be fooled. With 0 prior game dev experience and working on this as a hobby project, it took me about 2 months to build the prototype. Also, of course, I refactored my project multiple times, changing around parts of the game architecture and using all the cool new things and best practices I learned along the way. For example, while reading up on game architecture, I came across the scriptable object architecture, which was made popular by a great 2017 Unite talk by Ryan Hipple, and I'll link to that video down in the description. The idea is to use scriptable objects in some neat ways that make your architecture more modular and let you easily share data across components in your game. Another advantage is that you can modify and tweak values right in the editor instead of in code, which I initially didn't care about but have come to find quite convenient actually. So instead of defining this train speed variable directly in code, I can declare this reference to what is actually a scriptable object under the hood. Then I can create an instance of the float reference class, which I can modify right in the editor and which I can drop onto my script that holds the reference. By the way, I'm using a fantastic free package from the asset store that conveniently provides all the building blocks for a scriptable object architecture. I tried to implement this myself before I stumbled across the asset, and it's definitely a big time saver. Not that I was unable to implement it myself. Anyway, another smaller improvement I made was to replace my 5 differently colored train sprites with a single grayscale sprite that I now color in code or in the editor. This is not exactly revolutionary, but I only realized that I really should do this while watching another devlog that showcases this technique. So I keep learning new stuff and I'm constantly updating my project to try things out and keep it healthy. This definitely costs more time than just plumbing things together until they work, at least for a smaller project like mine, I'm guessing it does. But I think that's fine and working as intended, since I'm not only trying to make a game, but also trying to learn how to do so properly. And finally, here are some of the things I struggled with. One issue I found quite annoying were the resolution and anti-aliasing settings in Unity. My game looked ugly with pixelated sprites and jagged track lines. To resolve this, I had to change some settings in multiple places. I created new custom resolution presets for my PC monitor and tablet. Then I also had to change some settings in the quality tab in my project settings. I was surprised that anti-aliasing is actually turned off by default for all quality presets, and I'll have to check at which stage I should start using it. For now, I arbitrarily enabled it for some higher quality presets and made one of them the default. However, still when I ran the game after making this change, it didn't look different. So eventually I found out that I also had to change this setting in my camera component to enable anti-aliasing. And finally, the sprites and tracks started to look decent. Something else I did not figure out immediately was how to best define curved lines, in my case train tracks, in order to draw them and to move objects along their paths. In my prototype you can see I still use only straight tracks, and I simply use the line renderer's position data to move the trains along the lines. I've since learned about tweening engines, which let you easily define paths, including smooth curves, and will then move objects along them while taking care of all the position calculations and interpolation. So I was very happy to delete the ugly half-working code I had come up with and to start using LeanTween, a free tweening engine you can find on the asset store. Maybe I'll talk more about this in a future video, feel free to let me know in the comments if you're interested in this topic. Apart from these examples, I think it just takes a while to develop an intuition for how to best structure a game, since there are usually a lot of different ways to accomplish the same thing. So where would you go from this starting point? I'm really curious to hear some opinions, so let me know. And remember to subscribe to see how I turned my prototype into something, well, a bit better, and how I continue to work on the game, of course. And maybe how I finish it at some point.